welcome to MATChat, and if this is your first time joining us, a very warm welcome to our little corner of the internet where trusted leadership gets real. This is no fluff, it's no corporate jargon and no death by PowerPoint. I'm Laura Williams, your host, guide and resident maths enthusiast, and I'm a coach and trainer for school leaders with 20 years experience across the sector, including time served as a COO, a CFO, a school business manager, a trustee and governor, and a bunch of other stuff as well. If you don't know about MATChat, it was actually born out of a number of conversations at events with myself and Abby at Schools Advisory Service over tea, coffee, and actually the occasional glass of wine, where we laughed and ranted and realised that one-off webinars just weren't enough. We needed something regular and real and rooted in the messy, meaningful reality of trust leadership. And each of the episodes that we're hosting is a chance to slow things down and have the kinds of conversations that usually kind of get squeezed out of the day job, and the ones that we want to talk about: leadership, strategy, collaboration, challenge and change. We talk to the people living it every day, asking the big questions, the awkward ones, and the ones we all think about but don't always say out loud. So if you missed episode 1, you can catch up over at schooladvice.co.uk/MATChat. We kicked off episode 1 with Dominic Broad, talking about the triangle that haunts every Mat leader's dreams, which is culture, capacity and change. And next week for episode 3, we're joined by Chris Whitmore for a deep dive into the legal aspects of growth and rebrokering. But this is episode 2, and today I'm joined by another fantastic guest. This is Alice Gregson, CEO of Forum Strategy, a thriving national membership organisation for executive leaders in academy trusts. She joined Forum as COO in January 2020, becoming executive director in January 2021. Over her time at Forum Strategy, she has developed thought leadership pieces, written for the media, provided keynote speeches, and facilitated hundreds of events and meetings for trust leaders. She's also the driving force behind Forum's Being the CEO report, now in its 5th year, and that is what we're getting into today. We'll be unpacking how the role of Mat CEO is shifting, what's keeping leaders awake at night, and why succession planning is one of the big conversations that we need to be having. So expect trends, straight talk, and a few well-placed truths. Whether you're leading a trust, thinking about it, or just curious about what it takes to navigate Mat leadership in 2025, this is for you. So if you've got any questions for myself or Alice, please make a note of them or pop them in the chat box as we go along. We've established it is working, so please use the chat box. We will collect the questions and we'll pick them up at the end, because we are going to make time for a live Q&A. So without further ado, let's dive in. Welcome, Alice. Hi, Alice.
Morning, Laura. Thanks for the invite. Great to be with everyone this morning. Thank you.
I've really been looking forward to this conversation, because I always say I am a bit of a Mat geek, but I am also a data geek. So your report was very interesting to me. So let's just start off with, before we kind of dig into the data and before I ruin all to give away all the spoilers, let's talk first about Forum Strategy, because there may be people on this call that don't know anything about Forum. So who are Forum and what do they do?
Brilliant. Thanks, Laura. So for those of you who've not come across Forum Strategy before, welcome, and I hope that we can kind of pique your interest to find out a little bit more. So as a bit of background, Forum Strategy, we're a membership organisation for CEOs, COOs and education leaders in multi-academy trusts. We were established in 2013, so quite a long time ago now. So we've been providing leadership development and kind of connection, I would describe it as, across the sector for over a decade now. So we've been there since really the early formation of academy trusts. If I was to describe our core mission, because I think that's really important for people to understand, it's really around how we support and grow and help trust leaders to thrive in what is, of course, a very complex educational landscape at the moment. So we offer that support through our 3 national networks. We also offer that through our Being the CEO programme, and we also do some kind of bespoke consultancy here or there. The other thing I would just say is, because I think, you know, there's quite a few organisations out there, aren't there? And what is it that makes Forum special? There's a few things really. One is that we are completely independent. So we don't receive any government funding for what we do, which means we can be completely accountable to our members. We are definitely forward thinking and strategic thinking, and we work cross-sector as well. So not only do we work within education to bring great speakers, great thinkers into the mix, we also do a lot of cross-sector thinking as well. So I think they're the things that I would say stand Forum out, as well as obviously our values and our kind of commitment to the sector.
Just to kind of touch on that, you said 3 national networks. What are those networks?
Yeah, so the three networks reflect who we support. So multi-academy trust CEOs, chief operating officers, and a network we call education leaders, which is for head teachers, executive heads, leaders of improvement effectively across trusts. So that's our three networks. Our first one that we established was CEOs, and then we've kind of broadened out because of the kind of close relationship between CEOs and their executive teams.
In terms of your experience, because obviously I've read your bio, I did the intro. Tell us a little bit more about how kind of you came into this, because I know you've got an interesting background in your leadership. I'm just really curious. Again, we're talking about leadership, so I feel like I want to know a bit more about you and where you've come from.
Yeah, of course. So, so as you rightly said at the beginning, Laura, so I joined Forum Strategy in 2020, starting out as a chief operating officer, which I felt, really grounded me in some of the kind of operational aspects to leadership, and was a really good starting point for then kind of stepping up to exec director and then CEO. But before that, I've worked across quite a few different sectors in kind of leadership and workforce development style roles. So I've worked in the police service, I've worked in adult social care and health, and I've also worked in central government for a short while. But the thing that really kind of ignited my passion around education was my time working at the National College for School Leadership, where I was working on succession planning for head teachers and equality, diversity, inclusion initiatives. So that really kind of stuck in my heart for a long time in terms of, the difference that education makes, and that it's at the heart of everything, that we do in society. So it was really great when kind of Michael came back to me a decade later and offered me the position at Forum. And it was just a great opportunity to come back into education. And the thing for me that really kind of gravitated me to Forum is just how special it is in many ways. It's kind of connections to education and to cross-sector, but also the kind of vision and values of the organisation. It's something that's really important for me to work somewhere that's got that authenticity and that commitment.
That is actually, I think, mirrored in the report, isn't it? Because one of the statistics which I thought was really interesting was that 71% of respondents said that they became a CEO to make a bigger difference, which I thought was actually really nice to see. I don't often see that presented in that way, or people being asked such a direct question of, well, why are you doing it? Because when you ask people, they tend to just kind of roll their eyes and go, I don't know. It's so stressful. Yeah. But yeah, we're all in education to make a difference. It was really interesting to hear that. Thanks, Alice.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So being the CEO report, 5 years in, tell us, why did it start and how has it evolved, and why did you create it in the first place? What are you looking for, and how do you use it in the sector?
Yeah, so being the CEO report, I would obviously say is an important piece of research for the sector, because when it was first developed, which was, as you've said, Laura, 5 years ago, it really was the first report of its kind to delve in depth into the experiences and views of Academy Trust CEOs. Our first one was published in 2020, which, as we know, was a particularly challenging time around COVID. I know we picked a good time to do that one, but it was interesting, obviously capturing views and perspectives at that time. So, we've been able to then track since 2020 to 2024, which was the latest report, how some of those perspectives and views and experiences have changed over that time. And the reason I think that's so important is I think we should be listening to everybody in the sector. The listening piece is so important, and the leadership perspective that we can get from different layers in the sector is so important. And it just seems to me that CEOs have got such an impact and an influence on the organisations they serve, but also the sector as a whole. So if we can understand some of their perspectives, some of their challenges, some of their priorities, then I think we start to unpick some of the impact that has across the sector, and how we kind of bring all of that together. So I think that listening piece around those experiences is really important. And the other aspect to that is I think there's a lot of myths around what the CEO role does and doesn't do. And so it gives us an opportunity to kind of address some of that as well, I would say.
How wide do you spread the report? Is it shared openly across the sector, or is it just to members? Or, I mean, I think we'll probably share a link anyway, but how do you kind of share that, and how do other organisations engage with it?
Yeah, so we do share it openly. There are a few reports here and there that We do share openly as an organisation because part of our commitment to the sector is doing that. Obviously, there's quite a few reports that we do that we need to keep member only because it's part of the benefit of being a member of Forum. But certainly, the being the CEO report, yeah, we share that widely. So if anybody wants to take a look, if we can maybe post a link in the chat, then yeah, it's something we really want to share as wide as possible.
Okay, right. So I'm really, really good. I've got all of the stats in front of me that I want to speak to you about. But first of all, like from your point of view, what are the top 3 trends that you have noticed across the 5 years? What are the things that have markedly shifted, whether it's been in a positive way or a negative way?
Yeah, I mean, quite a few, to be honest, but let me just headline a few and then we can perhaps kind of broaden out from there. So I think one of the really interesting things that we've noticed is how the experience and therefore the stability of the CEO role has been evolving. So from our research, nearly half of the respondents to the last survey that we did had been in their CEO role for over 5 years, which, you know, we're seeing kind of increase in terms of length of tenure. And then the other interesting fact to put alongside that was that quite a vast majority of those CEOs were still in their first CEO role. So effectively what that means is the CEOs have joined their organization and they've stayed there and they've stayed committed to that organization. And what's great about that is obviously the experience, the knowledge kind of gets retained within that organization, and you haven't got this thing of CEOs moving around all over the place. You know, they're committing and they're staying true to those organizations through the good times and the bad. And I think that's such an important thing for the sector right now when we've got so much change going on politically and, you know, as a society as well. Did you want to pick up anything on that, Laura?
I hope I'm not spoiling anything moving ahead of what you're saying, but again, with the report, it was interesting because I was like, great, that's founder CEOs, there is commitment there. But it also feels like because that's such a huge chunk that we might be about to peak. And if they all decide to start moving around at the same time, and I'm just conscious of the succession planning stat. And I mean, I know it's got better. I think one of the trends is that succession planning has improved across. I think it was only a third of MATs were doing succession planning for the CEO, and now I think it's almost half or just over half. But again, I don't know, are we going to see a tipping point, do you think, in terms of when people do start moving? Or because again, one of the stats putting it alongside it is that a third of them are looking to retire at some point in the next few years. So it feels good for now, but what does that mean looking to the next 5 years?
Yeah, so a couple of interesting things to pick up there, I think. So that bit that you've mentioned around founder CEOs. So even though our kind of data is showing that people are going into their first CEO role and staying there, it doesn't necessarily mean they're founders. So what we are seeing, I think, is more of a balance now across the sector as the years go on of founder CEOs and just people coming in and kind of what we call second generation CEOs. So whilst that stat kind of implies that it's their first CEO role, they're not necessarily the founders. So we're kind of seeing more of a diversity now in the sector of those people who kind of set up the trusts and stayed there and became the CEO, and then a kind of influx of what, you know, new blood really into the role of second generation CEOs. So the challenges you've rightly identified is with the founder second generation CEOs, it's how you retain some of that knowledge that the founders had when they first set up the organizations. And, you know, when CEOs retire, regardless of whether they're a founder or not, it's still that challenge of retention of knowledge, retention of experience, and, you know, having enough handover so that there's a kind of smooth transition. So that piece around succession planning is really, really important. From our report, we did see an uptick in terms of originally it was only about a third, as you've said, of trusts who or CEOs who knew about a succession plan being in place, and that changed over 1 year to become 50%. So we're seeing that stat change, but it still means that you've got 50% of trust CEOs who there either isn't a succession plan in place or they don't know about one. And the risk to that, of course, is, as you say, if they retire or something comes up, you know, life happens, doesn't it? And sometimes the CEO can't be there. What are the plans around retaining the knowledge and experience of that person and making sure that that leadership stays stable? So the succession plan bit is a really important part of what the board should be focusing on.
Do you think that the CEO role and the patterns that you're seeing in terms of their recruitment and retention is mirroring that of kind of a head teacher? Because again, you have head teachers that maybe do 5 to 7 years, then they move on to their next, role. Usually, I know some people stay longer, some people stay less, but broadly speaking, there is kind of a finite period, isn't it, where people are looking for the next challenge. They've achieved what they wanted to achieve and they move on. Do you think that we'll see that mirrored potentially?
I think it's really hard to say on that, because I think it depends upon where somebody's up to in their career and their overall tenure. If you're older, perhaps you don't want to move around as much and actually you want to finish your tenure in education within a trust. You might find that your trust is growing, so you're getting that kind of challenge through additional schools coming on. So I think it's really hard to say if there's a trend or not. The interesting thing I would say is that we have got a fair few CEOs in the sector who have been a CEO and stayed in their trust for over 10 years. So I think it's hard to say without digging into it, but I think it's interesting that there's still quite a few who've kind of stayed in past a decade and wanted to kind of commit to that organisation.
And that might be, again, we've talked a little bit about the political climate around us. Obviously, it's ever changing and in so many ways and at so many levels. But again, it probably feels like a new organisation every time. The growth agenda is different. And I don't know if you want to kind of pick up on that. There were some stats in there about growth and what CEOs' view of growth might look like.
Yeah, and just before I do that, actually, I forget the piece of research, but just to touch back on that bit around how long CEOs would serve in an organisation before moving on. But there is some research out there, and I will try and dig it out, which says that actually your first 5 years of being a CEO, you're still learning, actually. You're still kind of learning the ropes, you're getting acclimatized to the organisation, you're tackling things that have come along in that 5 years. So actually, the more effective, successful CEOs we often see are the ones who've kind of stayed in place for over 5 years and longer to kind of see through some of that change that happens over sort of a decade or longer. So there is some research. I'll try and dig that out and share it as a link afterwards. But yeah, in terms of growth, it's a really good point, actually. So what's really interesting is obviously, if we go back a couple of years, the foot was very much on the pedal of expansion and trust growth, driven quite significantly from the government, wasn't it, at that time? They were sort of saying, look, we want to see trust grow, we want to see this magical number of 10 plus, that's the magical number of success, which, I don't believe that's true. I think there's something around scale, which is really important, but I don't think there's some magical number that means you're an effective trust and you're not. But there was that push from government at that time. And obviously, since the new government, can we still call them new? But yeah, let's call them new. The new government have kind of taken that foot off the pedal. And so that kind of emphasis around growth is not so much anymore coming from the government. And so we're seeing that reflected in some of the findings from the report. I think we had some, let me just find these statistics here, where basically the number of schools that trusts were predicting they would have in their trust was much smaller a year on. So from last year, it was much smaller than, a year before that. So definitely this kind of move away from growth to just thinking actually, what's going to be best for the organisation. And I think that might be quite a positive, actually. So we've always kind of pushed this emphasis on growth only when it's right for the schools and the communities, not doing what needs to be done because the government says so. So I think what having that lack of government emphasis on it does is it means that where growth is happening, it's happening for the right reasons. So yeah, very much seeing that.
It's purposeful and deliberate and, like I say, for the right reasons. I think in the report, it was 44% have said they think they'll be leading maths of 10 or less in 3 years, which was actually 30% in 2023. So, and they're prioritising sustainability and quality. And I know from conversations that I've been having with people in the math sector is that there are actually pushback, I think, conversations happening on growth, but we can't take that many. You need to slow down because there are still, people who are trying to push like 10 schools, you need to take these 10 schools this year. And it's a huge pressure on the infrastructure of a MAT anyway. I mean, I've done conversions before and not to that scale, and I can't imagine what multiplying that up to 10 schools would look like. So yeah, it's an interesting trend. And I think we've just had a comment in from Helen. I've been CEO for just over a decade and I'm still loving the exciting roller coaster on. We've had the same 15 primaries, 6,000 children since February 17, and we've strengthened the quality and impact of what we do. So again, it's quality, sustainability, improvement. So our team has changed. So my role feels very different. Yeah, it because of everything around us, it probably does feel like, you know, every year it's a new organisation facing a new set of challenges. I think it was interesting. Unsurprisingly, one of the stats was that the financial pressure has risen to the top of the priorities of CEOs.
Yes, yeah, and you know that will be the case across the sector. It's not necessarily just unique to CEOs, but obviously being in the positions that they are, that kind of finance bit is, you know, is front and center, isn't it? It's, you know, there's been a number of things I think that people are worried about, including CEOs, you know, everything from the rising staffing costs, you know, unfunded pay rises, that side of things, all the way through to, you know, just the cost of supplies and the cost of estates, and just everything is just so much more expensive, and the funding levels sadly are not kind of keeping up with that. And it's something that all of us in a united voice across the sector just keep saying to the government, we need more money, we need more funding. But you know, it's just very, very tough, and those difficult decisions that have to be made during those times are incredibly tough and really do take their toll on leaders in particular, I think. One thing that we know, you know, trusts are trying to do more of, and you know, this very much being led by CEOs and COOs, is this idea of how you kind of generate more funding through kind of partnerships with businesses, you know, partnerships with local you know, local businesses, local companies that actually might help to bring in a bit of money as well. Other things we're starting to see are, you know, trusts who are setting up traded subsidiaries. So they're providing services to other trusts and in some cases to local authority schools where they've got something that they do really well, you know, and they're not offering that to make a profit necessarily. They're offering it to cover the cost of what it takes to kind of deliver a service like that. But you know, there's some really creative thinking that's going on. And I think if we were to take any kind of positive from the financial situation, it is that it's kind of generating more innovation and creativity. And that's very much being led front and centre from trusts as well as schools. So it's good to see some of that at least. But it is very, very tough out there. Very tough.
I was actually speaking to a CEO recently, and they were actually talking about they've got some kind of specialist knowledge in their trust in a particular area, and they're developing a program and some software, and they're going to basically use that as best practice and sell it, you know, to you know, they're literally doing all kinds of things to, like say, to be innovative, and it will add value, absolutely, but also, like say, contribute to the running costs of the trust, because we have to be thinking differently about where we can get those funds. It was interesting. I can't remember where I've seen it, but I've seen it. A few people have been talking to me about it recently. There's been an article somewhere, or some journalist has been talking about the luxury of kind of back office staff, haven't they, in schools? And it was interesting because it kind of was, you know, in your report, there's been a trend. I'm pleased to say, obviously, that, you know, 42% had COOs back in 2020, and now 79% have COOs, because it's normally been the CFO role, understandably, that has been the focus. Is there a view on that Forum has? I know you have a COO network, but how do we feel about, you know, back office staff, infrastructure, the cost of that, and the need for those staff?
You see, I think they're absolutely essential. You know, when you think about how a trust is kind of overseeing several schools in one go, you've got to have some kind of central function to do that and to drive out the value for money. So this whole kind of term that's often used around like top slicing and you know, this kind of stuff, I think is such a negative term in itself. It should be more about, you know, the trust investment, because what the trust needs to do is invest in an infrastructure that helps to drive out that value for money, that level of support that we see so often across trust that you don't get if you're a standalone school. You know, you've got to be able to invest in that. So we actually see that as a very positive trend, that more CEOs are seeing the added value and the importance of having a COO or an equivalent role that is looking at operational effectiveness and how you drive out value for money, how you drive out effectiveness, but just as importantly, and if not more importantly, how you provide really good support to each of the schools that you work alongside and you oversee. That's one thing that I think is not talked about enough, is actually through a kind of trust structure, that kind of level of support that you get is very different to what you have as a standalone school. You've got access to HR professionals, IT professionals, a whole range of people who've got really kind of bespoke skills. And, if you have more capacity in those teams, then obviously they can serve the schools much better. And that's what it's all about. It's not about building structures for structure's sake. It's about saying, actually, we need to be able to have the capacity to support you as schools in the way that you deserve.
It's interesting, isn't it, though, this idea about kind of structure, because that's the freedom of an academy trust, isn't it? And I've been part of many conversations and I've supported many conversations about what is the trust about? What are we going to support you with? What autonomy does the school have? The tedious at times, but very important document that is the scheme of delegation. Who does what, who is accountable for what, and therefore, in many cases, who pays for what, in terms of it's about decisions. Are we going to, have our own attendance team? Are we going to have our own IT infrastructure? All of those kind of things. And I think that I find that the most exciting thing about trust is, trying to create something that meets the needs of the context and everyone can kind of do it differently.
Kind of I think it's really interesting, Laura, because one of the things I was just going to mention is, so we run a system leadership group for CEOs as part of what we do at Forum, and one of the things the CEOs was reflecting on recently was that they are able to generate capacity to be part of a group that's looking at system-wide improvement only because of the structure they've got in a trust. So the trust that they've got, if he's out contributing to this group and looking at how system-wide improvement takes place and kind of looking at that holistic view of the system, then he's got people who can kind of step in and pick things up, and he can trust those people to keep the trust moving and keep providing that important support to the schools while he's out thinking about, how do we improve the system from within and do all of that important work. If you haven't got that capacity, then all people end up doing is being very insular and only being able to focus on firefighting effectively. What we're talking about here is having a structure in place that enables you to be more strategic, more forward thinking, and to be able to contribute to the system as a whole. If you didn't have that capacity, I'm not sure you'd be able to do it.
It's interesting. I've had a conversation with the trust recently about capacity, and we've just had a comment in from Helen. She says, we've only got 10 people in our central team, and with our embedded culture of collective efficacy, we use the expertise of our school leaders. The idea of capacity, and it immediately correlates to headcount, is an interesting one, isn't it? Because I've had conversations like, someone was very proud of a growth strategy, and there's like, because we're not employing any more people, and I'm like, but that doesn't mean that you won't need capacity. You might have third-party SLAs or, temporary contracts or whatever, but you need to look at what that looks like and like you say, try and kind of bake it into the structure as much as you can. But also coming back to that idea of the CEO being able to go out and do kind of outward looking and forward thinking, then it comes back to what is the role of the CEO? Because if the CEO is literally, and not that they shouldn't ever, but, got their sleeves up and kind of in the weeds with everything, like, are they doing the role of a CEO or the way it should be done, or for the best use of the organisation?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So one of the biggest challenges I think particularly new CEOs find is that kind of how you get that balance of strategic and operational, because many of them, still it's a majority who come from a teaching background, who have been former head teachers, how you move your mindset from thinking in that respect to actually, I'm now overseeing a whole organization, and that's going to require a different type of thinking. If you're pulled down in the weeds too much, then you're not going to have that time available to do the stuff that actually not many other people can do, that you need to be able to take a step back and do that strategic thinking. I think in the report, actually, we drew on what was some of the kind of key thinking and learning that had come from CEOs while in the role. And one of those definitely was around getting that balance right between strategic and operational. The other one I think that was really important was around having a really clear leadership narrative and being clear on what the vision, mission and values of the organisation are, but also, you know, what it is that the leadership does and what the CEO is there to do, what the COO is there to do, and being really clear and transparent on some of that is really important. But it's a big challenge, I think, that kind of push and pull of operational and strategic. And really some of the best CEOs that we've seen are the ones that are able to kind of take a step back, trust in their team, who've hopefully got a really good diverse range of skills and backgrounds, and then they take a step back and stay really strategic, and, you know, as part of that, work really closely with the board as well.
You've just mentioned it there, and I'm wondering if I'm not saying it would be any better. I think there would be different challenges, but I did note in the report, I think, is it 8% of CEOs aren't from a teaching background now? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of obviously based on our respondents. We can't necessarily say that that's kind of representative of the sector, but yeah, based upon our kind of responses, that's the case. But then what's interesting about that stat is that the attitudes in terms of whether you should have a teaching background are shifting significantly. I think over the space of our 5-year report, we've seen those attitudes change quite a bit. So, you know, it used to be that the vast majority of respondents said, absolutely, to be a CEO of a trust, you need to have had a teaching background. And now we're seeing that kind of flip the opposite way, where actually more people than not think actually you don't need to necessarily have had a teaching background. The only caveat I would add to that, and people always put this in the comments because we obviously have the, you know, open text box underneath each of the questions, is that is very much dependent upon the team that you've got around you. So if you are from a non-teaching background, you need to have an incredibly strong team who've got that experience of education, they've got experience of leading schools, they've got that school improvement experience. Otherwise, yeah, it just doesn't work. So it needs to be, you know, that kind of hand in glove relationship between the CEO and their executive team.
I always say it's two sides of the same coin, and I understand in a school that it's the head teacher is the head teacher. I understand that, but again, obviously, I am a non-teacher. I have views on this. I know many people. I know CEOs who are non-teachers, and I know aspirational CEOs who are non-teachers. I do think, like you say, it's about making sure that all of the kind of needs of the organisation are covered. So whether it's a deputy CEO or a director of school improvement or whatever it is that you want to call it. I think as long as all of those interests are represented, it shouldn't preclude anyone from being a CEO. It was interesting. I think someone had said small trusts need teacher CEOs, but big ones not so much, I think was one of the quotes. What is there a view on that? Do you agree with that?
I suppose when you're a smaller trust, you by default might have a smaller executive team and therefore perhaps less diversity to draw on. That's the only link I can kind of see between that. It goes back to that point around who the CEO is working with and alongside. So yeah, if you're a smaller trust, you've got a smaller executive team, and therefore you haven't got the diversity of perspectives to draw from. Then yeah, I guess you could argue that the CEO needs to have had that background. But I think the thing for me is we become very obsessed, and this happens across all sectors, it's not just education. We become so obsessed with experience, we forget about skills. And actually experience you can kind of draw from other people on. You can kind of have experience through virtue of working with others who've got it. The skills bit is the bit that's much harder. You know, it's harder to draw skills from other people that actually a CEO needs to have. So when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about that kind of strategic mindset, that ability to kind of think higher level at a kind of strategic view. I'm thinking about cultivating relationships with the board. I'm thinking about, you know, all of the kind of role and responsibilities that come with being a CEO and how you kind of get your head around that. So there's a lot to be said for actually focusing more on what skills do we need as CEOs rather than purely just what the experience should be.
There's an interesting stat that kind of links with that kind of stands alone, and it could be interpreted a few ways. I just wanted to know what you thought. It says 72% of CEOs say that leading people was the best preparation for their job. but only 7% that managing key business functions was the best preparation for the job. So do you think that bears out what you've said in terms of actually, as long as I've got an expert leading that business function, I don't need to know so much about it?
I think that's where it comes from. Absolutely, yeah. Because I think the kind of response to that is, if we've got all these business functions that we need to oversee, IT, HR, school improvement, all of these areas, if we've got the right people in place to lead those, then actually the CEO themselves doesn't need to be in the detail of that, and they don't need to have had direct experience. But what I would say is they do need to have had enough, they need to have enough knowledge that they can hold those people to account effectively. So if you're a CEO and you've got absolutely zero knowledge of IT, HR, school improvement, all of these areas, then you're not going to be able to hold those people to account effectively and be able to say, this is what I need you to do, this is what I need you to focus on. So it is a really careful balance. I think what I'm trying to say is that the CEO doesn't need to be, an expert knowledge, have that expert knowledge of certain areas, but they do need to have enough that they can, oversee people who have.
Okay, all right. I've got percentages flying around in front of my eyes at the moment. Are there any trends that we haven't picked up on that you'd like to kind of touch on? Any stats that you think are interesting that we should be flagging?
Yeah, so just a couple of things. One is where, CEOs draw their support from, because that was one of the things that we asked within it. And then the other is just around some of the views around the current government, which could be quite interesting to delve into. So the one around support, I think this is so important for people. When you're in a leadership position in particular, it's often a very lonely place. And a lot of the CEOs that we work with will say that, I've got nobody really that I can turn to, because as CEO, you've got your team, obviously, but there's only so much that you can share in that respect. You've got your board, but again, you've only got so much you can share. So where do you go to get support and make that, really important role feel a little bit less lonely? So from our report, definitely the number one area that they said, they draw that support from is facilitated leadership networks, which I suppose you could say they're a little bit biased because they're part of one. And so it's the first thing that comes to mind. But I thought it was really interesting that was kind of number one ahead of a couple of other areas, which was coaching and mentoring being a core piece of support, and peer support. So just turning to one another and being able to kind of call up a fellow CEO and be able to kind of share your experiences with is really important. And so I think this is just something that's becoming more and more important, that people have access to that support, and that it's support that really is genuine and creates connection and belonging, and just helps people to feel a little bit less lonely. I think it's really important.
What do you think, and again, I'm sure you will answer it on behalf of Forum, but what do facilitated networks offer that, that peer support or coaching and mentoring, formal or informal, kind of provide? I know you said like belonging and community. I was thinking about what we were saying before about, people getting lost in the weeds and, trying to do that. Is that where facilitated networks kind of come in? Is it kind of speaking to those things that maybe we wouldn't raise ourselves, if that makes sense?
It does make sense. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, a few things. I think, yeah, definitely that connection and belonging piece. I think a network can call itself a network, but not have that kind of real kind of in-depth piece around connection and belonging. So even the word network, sometimes people kind of see that as you walk into a room and you try and meet as many people as you can, and you walk out and you still don't know them any better. That for me is the antithesis of what a great network should be. It really should be about how you connect people and forge those those connections with each other. I think, as you say as well, Laura, I think the really important bit is that it carves out space for that strategic thinking, that in the busyness of the job, a lot of CEOs, a lot of chief operating officers, education leaders, they just don't have the time to sit back and go, right, what is going on in the world of education, what's going on in the wider world, what's going on in the organization, and how am I going to navigate some of that? So what those kind of leadership networks provide, and obviously Forum is one, is just that time and space, and that dedicated time and space to do that sort of thinking, which is so important. Otherwise, all you'll end up doing is being lost in the firefighting, which is what we call it, and not thinking about the kind of navigation of, what does the future look like? What does 1 year look like? What does 2 years look like? So it's really important that it has that as well. And the other thing I would say is that there is a degree of gentle professional challenge, is the best way I can think to describe it, which is, that I think across our network, I've definitely seen colleagues kind of say to each other, I'm not sure I quite agree with you on that. I think the way that we see it is this way. And it's done in a really kind of professional, supportive way. But at the same time, you haven't got this thing of groupthink where everybody just agrees with each other. So I think a really important bit of those kinds of networks is that you have that healthy debate within it as well.
I see it sometimes in the business manager network conversations, and sometimes it's not even the people that are speaking, it's the people that are listening. And afterwards, I've had conversations and someone's gone, oh, I heard them talking about that and thought, oh, I don't know that, or oh, I need to do that. So they don't always have to actively engage to get something from it, in terms of, yes, you were facilitating those conversations, but even to listen to other conversations that people are having, even if you don't feel able to contribute, or you feel a little bit vulnerable admitting something, or saying something, or you didn't want to ask and you're glad somebody else did. I think that's just human nature anyway, but I think it is nice to have that space.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say as well, and it links to your point, Laura, which is that, you want to know that people are listening to you. And so when you join an organization, you want to know that you're not just going to be kind of preached at and given lots of information and that's it. As an organization, we really pride ourselves on that. We really listen to what it is that trust leaders want, what they need, the support that they need, and their opinions on things, like the Being the CEO report. I think particularly in a space where it feels like perhaps the government is only listening to certain people in the sector, that it's really important that people have that space where they know, doesn't matter your background, doesn't matter your experience, doesn't matter where you're at, we are going to listen to you. And we will never be a voice for you because you've got your own voice, but we will bring all of those voices together so that it becomes a collective voice. And I think that is what we need so much more of in the sector. Forget all the politics for a moment and let's come together and actually have a collective voice around some of these really big issues in the sector. It's really important. And the other thing, just to add to that, is I think what has been the case in the sector for a while is just this kind of underlying element of competition, particularly between trusts, and particularly ones that perhaps want to grow in a particular locality. And there's this kind of competition element of we need to get this school or that school. We absolutely need to do away with that. It is not healthy. It is not something that helps the sector to thrive. And so what organisations like Forum and others in the sector need to do is really make that clear, that competition is not something, there's no place for it in the sector. We need to be thinking together. So, we're quite clear when you join our networks that is not something that we welcome as part of the discussions.
I've heard someone describe them as beauty parades. Literally MATs are doing marketing pitches, and schools have literally got a schedule of like interviews, people coming in and selling their wares of, this is why you should join us and all of this. And obviously the problem with that, a bit like a political manifesto, is that people don't have to stick to it, do they? So, people get stuck.
Yeah, but the thing I would say about that is I do think it's important that trusts put their best foot forward and, make the case really clearly around why would you want to join our trust. I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. Otherwise, how would a school know? But don't do it at the expense of somebody else or a different trust. Like, don't use underhand tactics, do it in a transparent, clear way. And at the end of the day, the school will go with the trust if they want to join a trust. They don't have to. If they want to join a trust, they will go with the one that best suits their needs. But don't do it at the expense of the trust. Just put your best foot forwards, make the case, and then it's up to the school to choose, isn't it?
Exactly. So I've said this. I totally agree. You should absolutely know what it is you're about, who you are, what people will gain from joining you, and be honest, I think is the thing. But I've seen trusts kind of engaging, well, if you join us, we'll give you this, well, if you join us, well, we'll give you that instead, because it becomes like a bartering thing, which, like you say, competition and unhealthy kind of conversations, not positive. Just kind of we've touched on the board a few times in some of the things that we've said, but if there's someone from a board is, I don't know if they're on the call or if someone listens to this afterwards and they're on a board, how can they best support their CEO, do you think? Because I know there's a duality of they're there to support, but they're also there to challenge. How can a board or a chair of trustees make sure that their CEO is supported?
Yeah, so this is something we spend quite a bit of time on our Being the CEO program talking about, because of how important that relationship between the CEO and the chair in particular is. I think, in terms of advice, I think it's exactly that, get the balance right between providing support and, giving the CEO space to kind of talk through priorities, challenges, etc., but also professionally challenge. And I keep calling it gentle professional challenge, but there's probably better wording for it. But what I mean by that is, it's not about being vicious or being nasty to people. It's about saying, actually, if I've got a different view of something, or I think we can do something better, let me offer that to you to think about and take forward. So the best relationships we've seen between the chair and the CEO is that really careful balance where the chair is supportive, yet they are pushing the CEO, to kind of see the bigger picture as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot there in that relationship. And if you're a new CEO in particular, creating that relationship from the beginning is such an important part of getting the whole thing right, really. And there's some great relationships out there, where you're obviously not friends because you're in a professional capacity, but the CEO feels they can go to the chair about issues and challenges that are coming up without that fear of retribution. So I think it's just really important that relationship is developed really well.
And I say that honesty and being able to be honest with them, and whether it's this is how I feel or this is what's happening. And like I say, retribution, judgment. I've sat in some amazing board meetings and seen those relationships work really well, but I've seen some very difficult conversations and where the balance isn't quite right. So yeah, I think facilitated networks are probably great spaces to talk about that relationship as well, if that is an area that you're struggling with. I'm going
to the other thing I'd just add to that, Laura, if I can, if that's all right, is just around drawing on the board more. So one of the things I would say around this, so if you take recruitment and retention, one of the biggest challenges we've got in the sector, no one's escaping that. It is a big challenge for us all. If you think about the diversity of board members, often they've got so much knowledge and experience to draw from, from their different perspectives, whether that's private business, charity, education. So, again, some of the great CEOs are really good at harnessing that experience and that knowledge to address some of the big challenges like recruitment and retention or send or other things that we've got as big challenges. So yeah, I think it's about the chair and CEO relationship, but it's also how you kind of draw on that expertise from the wider board as well.
I was going to say, I don't think a board are more grateful than when they've got a HR person and a finance person on the board. They all look for that person immediately, like, right, we've got an HR issue, what do we do? So
yeah, it's so important, and that's why the diversity of the board is so important. That could be a whole other podcast, but it
could be, yes.
That is so important.
I'm going to open up the Q&A box for now, but while we'll continue talking, and you've mentioned the Being the CEO program that you run, so we'll continue talking about that. I'm just going to hit the Q&A button, so if anyone's got any questions about anything we've talked about so far, please pop them in there. But while that's happening, Alice, please tell me about Being the CEO and the program, what it's about, what makes it unique. And like I say, I know there's lots of different things out there, but also there are probably people who haven't heard of it at all, so tell us about it.
Yeah, and it's such an important part of what we do as well, and it links to it's a really important part of what Forum provides. So we're open at the moment for our 12th cohort, which is great to say really that we're 12 cohorts in, because we've been providing this program for so long. It was definitely the first program of its kind in the sector, and all credit to Michael Payne, who's developed it, and Sir Steve Lancashire, who now works with Michael on the program, because they've developed something really special. So the program itself is for serving, you can be new or you can be experienced CEOs, as well as people who might be aspiring to the role, and it's very much about providing a kind of framework almost for the role. So it's structured around Michael Payne's book, which is called Being the CEO as well. So if people have not read that book, I definitely suggest having a read of it. So the program is then to kind of complement the book and wraps around that. And essentially what it does is it provides a number of different development aspects that really kind of support those people on the program. So we've got coaching, mentoring, there's a number of residentials, there's online sessions, there's resources. And I think one of the things that just makes it really special is that it's not just education focused, but we draw from some fantastic contributors across sector as well, and we're really kind of committed to that, both within what we do as Forum as a whole, but certainly within the programme. There's also a study visit that we undertake with a trust as well during the course of the programme. So it's really, really special. It was the first of its kind, and I think the biggest thing I've heard people take away from it, alongside lots of other things, but the biggest thing was the relationships that they formed on the programme, that they've set them up for life, really, in terms of professional relationships and peer support. So yeah, it's fantastic. Steve and Michael do a fantastic job of leading it, and yeah, it's just something really special that's out there in the sector.
It's interesting, like you say, it feels like a deeper version of the facilitated network. You can join the network events and, like you say, be part of that, but actually doing this feels like it's more of a intense course, I suppose. And is it focusing on particular things? Is it a particular experience level that benefits more, or?
Not really, no, because of the way it's facilitated, because of Steve and Michael's experience in the sector. Sometimes you have a mix of those who have been serving for several years, those who are new to post, and those who are aspiring, and they kind of bring that together really well. A lot of people are members of the network, and then they also join the programme as well, because you do, as you've rightly said, Laura, you get different things from the programme and the network, and they kind of go hand in glove. But yeah, I think the real special aspect to it is just the way it's facilitated, and that relationship between Michael and Steve is really great when you're on the programme itself. So yeah, definitely one to take a look at.
Amazing. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. So first of all, what training would you recommend, especially for leadership skills? So obviously I know you've got being the CEO programme. Are there any other things that you do or that you're aware of, or even qualifications potentially? I don't know, anything that you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking kind of generically, so broadly, not just specific to education, I mean, the Institute for Leadership and Management is a good one. There's quite a lot of interesting stuff on there. They also do kind of coaching and mentoring qualifications, so definitely one to have a look at. I also go to the Chartered Leadership and Management Institute as well. That's quite a good one. CMI, I think, is the acronym. That's got plenty on there. And CIPD as well. I know that's more kind of HR focused, but there's some really interesting stuff on there. Yeah, I mean, that there's plenty out there, isn't there? I don't think anybody's short of avenues, but I suppose, yeah, the question is really around what are the better ones. They're the ones I would tend to go for, and of course I would say join Forum as well, because not just for the programme, but the networks and the learning that takes part as part of that is really, really important. So I think when we think about leadership, we're often thinking about kind of a course, almost like a kind of factory. You kind of go in one end and go through a course, and out comes a leader. And I don't think it quite works like that. I think it's about the informal stuff as well as the formal stuff, and you can kind of get that balance through Forum's networks for sure.
I think as well, I do a lot of coaching and mentoring, and I feel like the idea of leadership, like you say, that a course is just going to magically produce you, send you in and pop you out the other end of finished product. Like I say, I don't agree with that either, but I think coaching and mentoring can help, because actually we all lead in different ways. So the conversations that I have is not, well, how did you do it? It's a case of, how can I do it in a way that is authentic and right for me, and how I want to be seen as a leader and my values. I think the conversation that we had last time on MATChat with Dominic Broad was interesting, in terms of we'll all be different leaders and show different styles of leadership, but they have to still resonate and be kind of in sync with who we are as people. So I think I would say coaching and mentoring, whether it's, I know that you guys do that or whatever, or you would, maybe it's a peer that you already know that offers it, but I would say that's a good way forward.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just, and it links to the coaching and mentoring bit, is the unique value of great conversations, and we were talking about this before we joined the podcast, weren't we, Laura, that
Yeah,
actually just through virtue of somebody asking the right questions or giving you a new perspective, I just think that helps to develop you so well. So it's how you access some of that. So it might be coaching, mentoring, networks, courses. I would say combine all of those things
all of them.
together, and yeah, you'll be in a great place. Yeah.
You also have to be in the right place when you're talking about leadership, I think you have to be in the right place mentally to be able to open up that self-awareness and be ready to receive whatever it is that someone's saying. And like, so many people can say something to you, but somebody new might say it and it'll land for whatever reason, just because someone else has put it in a slightly different way. So I think that's, like you say, expose yourself to as much of that as possible, and something will land somewhere and resonate, and your brain will be receptive to it.
Yeah, and the one other thing I'd probably just add, sorry, Laura, is just around shadowing maybe as well.
Yeah.
That's the thing we don't talk about very often, is it? But if you're aspiring to a particular role, why not arrange some shadowing with that person? If we think about the CEO role, for example, I know of lots of CEOs out there, and I'm sure Helen would be one of them. I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot, Helen, that would be open to somebody coming and shadowing their role. Obviously it would have to be appropriate tasks that you're able to shadow, but you could get a bit of an insight into what that role looks like and the kinds of skills you might need to develop. So yeah, just kind of throw that one in the mix as well, potentially.
No, absolutely. And Helen has asked a question. She says, how can we work together to increase the membership of Forum to broaden your impact? You provide some great networks and development that many colleagues don't yet know about. I was going to say, I feel like I know about Forum, but it would be nice to understand how other people can get to find out, or how your members spread the word.
Yeah, and again, I'm not just saying it because you're here, Helen, but you've been great at this. And I think that's the power of it, is that, I can talk till the cows come home about how amazing Forum is, and I genuinely believe that. I'm a honest, authentic person myself, and I wouldn't work for an organization that I didn't feel had those values. But I think the real strength comes from people already in the network spreading the word and saying, actually, this has been my experience, this is what I've really valued. And obviously there's lots of avenues to do that. Social media, when you meet with people, just telling them a little bit more. And I think that's the power, is word of mouth is the most powerful thing, because at the end of the day, you're going to believe a peer more than you are somebody who represents the organization. And I know that that's how it works. So I think it's more just kind of spreading that message through the great, fantastic people that we've got in the network already. And I think the other thing I'd say is my door is always 100% open, and Michael will probably kill me for saying this, but this is just how I operate. I'm a yes, I like to speak to people. I like to have the opportunity to kind of talk about the organization. So I would just say, for anybody listening to this, or anybody who talks to somebody, just tell them to reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to have a chat.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Alice. I'm just checking. I think that's all the questions that we have had. Is there anything else you want to say before we sign off?
I guess just because one bit we didn't touch on was the government and the kind of political landscape, because I know how hard that is for people at the moment. It's constant chopping and changing, and there's potentially a new cabinet reshuffle happening, over coming weeks and months, and it's just constant change, isn't it? And that alongside what are very tough jobs for people already. So I suppose if I was going to finish on a message, it's really that, try and tune out some of the wider noise and kind of tune into the things that really matter. And I think that's what we try and do a lot of at Forum, is just to kind of say, look, of course you need to be aware of what's happening politically. We will champion your voices as much as we can to the government so they listen to you. But ultimately, what really matters is what you're doing in your trust, in your locality, the things that you're doing for your children and young people, and stay focused on that. That's where we'll keep you steady. And that's why, having peer networks and support at this point is really, really important.
Thanks so much, Alice. That's a great message to land on, actually. I say this, there's so much going on, but focus on the things that you can control and influence. That's where I think that is where your superpowers are. And that's a wrap then on episode 2 of MATChat. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, you've taken away some ideas, and hopefully feel a little bit less alone in the glorious madness that is trust leadership. If you like what you've heard, please make sure you register for the upcoming episodes over at schooladvice.co.uk/MATChat. You can find all of the scheduled sessions there, all the guests that we've got lined up for you, and all the good stuff. We'll be back next Thursday when I'll be joined by Chris Whitmore, CEO at The Schools People, for a deep dive into the legal aspects of growth and rebrokering. The do's, the don'ts, and the things that no one tells you, but you probably should know. So until then, thank you again, and I'll see you all next time on MATChat.